Welcome to Brother Grimm's Sleepy Time. In the later editions, Brothers Grimm had edited their tales to be more suitable for children, but the earliest versions of these stories weren't always meant for young ears. Although the recent popular hyperbole in some circles is to suggest that there's practically no difference between a Brothers Grimm fairy tale and a Friday the 13th movie, most of them aren't actually that dark, but some of them definitely are. Here are a few of the darkest tales that Disney isn't super likely to adapt to the big screen. For our first story of tonight, we'll be taking a look at the Goose Girl. A young princess is sent out to marry the prince of a distant kingdom, ending in a maid stuffed in a barrel that has been hammered full of nails, where she is then rolled to death. Absolute insanity for a fairy tale. This is certainly one of the most messed up tales in the Brothers Grimm collection. Here is the Goose Girl. Long ago, in a kingdom of rolling hills and grand castles, an old queen prepared to say goodbye to her beloved daughter. The princess was wed to a prince from a distant land, a union meant to bind two kingdoms together in peace and prosperity. The queen, though frail with age, spent weeks preparing for her daughter's journey, selecting the finest dowry, a treasure trove of gold, silver, and jewels. Yet amidst all the splendor, the queen knew that her daughter's journey would be perilous. The world beyond the palace gates was vast and cruel, and even royal blood offered no guarantee of safety. In a moment of quiet resolve, the queen took her daughters aside. With a small knife, she pricked her own finger, letting 3 drops of blood fall onto a pure white handkerchief. She handed it to her daughter, her eyes solemn. "Keep this close," the queen said. "It may save you when all else fails." The princess, though young and trusting, understood the gravity of her mother's gesture. She tucked the handkerchief into her dress, kissed her mother farewell, and mounted her horse, a noble creature with eyes that seemed to hold secrets of their own. By her side rode a waiting woman, a servant meant to protect and guide her. Together, they set off toward the distant kingdom. The first day of the journey was uneventful, the road winding through the sunlit forests and meadows. But by the second day, the mood shifted. The princess, unaccustomed to the rigors of travel, grew thirsty under the midday sun. She turned to her waiting woman and asked for water. "Fetch it yourself," the woman replied coldly. The princess, now startled by the servant's insolence, dismounted and knelt by a brook to drink. As she bent down, the 3 drops of blood whispered to her, "If your mother knew, her heart would break." The princess sighed, but said nothing. As the journey continued, the servant's defiance grew. When the princess asked again for water, the response was harsher. "I am no slave," the waiting woman sneered. Again, the princess was forced to kneel by a stream, her golden cup forgotten as she cupped her hands to drink. This time, as she bent low, the handkerchief slipped from her dress and floated away on the current. The princess, distracted by her thirst and tears, didn't notice, but the waiting woman did. A cruel smile crept across her face. Without the protection of the 3 drops of blood, the princess's fate was sealed. The waiting woman seized her chance. offering the princess to dismount. "The horse is mine now," she declared, "and you will ride this sorry nag instead." The princess, though stunned by the betrayal, lacked the strength to resist. Stripped of her fine clothes and mounted on a broken-down horse, she could only watch as her waiting woman rode ahead on her horse, her stolen finery glittering in the sunlight. By the time they reached the foreign kingdom, the princess had been reduced to the status of a servant. The waiting woman, now dressed as a bride, was welcomed with open arms. The prince, eager to meet his betrothed, lifted her from the horse and led her inside, never suspecting the deception. The real princess, left in the courtyard, stood in her plain dress, her once bright eyes clouded with despair. But the old king, father of the prince, happened to glance out the window. He saw her standing there, her posture delicate despite her humble clothes, and his heart stirred with pity. "Who is that young woman?" he asked. The false bride, now drunk on her newfound power, dismissed the question. "Just a servant I brought along for company. Put her to work." And so, the princess was sent to tend geese alongside a boy named Conrad. It was a humble life, far removed from the luxury she had known, but the princess bore it with quiet dignity. The waiting woman, though clever, was not without fear. She worried that the horse, the very same who had seen everything, might reveal the truth. One morning, she demanded that the horse be killed. The princess heard of this plan and wept bitterly. In secret, she approached the butcher and begged him to nail the horse's head above the gateway she passed each day. The man, moved by her sorrow, agreed. The next morning, as she led the geese through the gate, she looked up and whispered, "O horse, dost thou hang there?" The horse's head, enchanted even in death, replied, "Princess, dost thou so meanly fare? But if thy mother knew thy pain, her heart would surely break in twain." This strange ritual repeated each day, a quiet act of defiance and remembrance. Life with the geese was monotonous, but not without its small dramas. Conrad, the goose boy, was both fascinated and annoyed by the princess. Her golden hair, which she let down each morning to comb in the meadow, gleamed like sunlight, and Conrad often tried to snatch a lock for himself. But the princess had her own magic. Each time Conrad approached, she would chant, "O wind, blow Conrad's hat away, make him run after as it flies, while I with my gold hair will play, and bind it up in seemly wise." The wind obeyed, whisking Conrad's hat across the meadow and sending him scrambling. By the time he returned, the princess's hair was pinned neatly in place, and she sat as serene as ever. Conrad, frustrated by this daily humiliation, went to the old king and demanded a new assignment. When pressed, he recounted the strange events at the gate and in the meadow. Intrigued, the king decided to investigate. The next morning, he hid behind the gate and heard the princess speak to the horse. He followed her to the meadow and watched as the wind carried away Conrad's hat. The king, though puzzled, sensed there was more to the story. That evening, he summoned the princess and gently urged her to tell the truth. But the princess, bound by an oath, could only weep. The king, seeing her anguish, suggested she confide in the iron oven. Desperate, the princess did as she was told, pouring out her sorrow to the lifeless oven. Unbeknownst to her, the king listened from outside. When she finished, he stepped forward and revealed himself. "You are the true bride," he said softly. The king wasted no time exposing the false bride. At a grand feast, he recounted the tale of betrayal, asking the impostor what punishment such a crime deserved. Unaware that she was condemning herself, the false bride suggested a punishment so cruel it sent shivers through the hall. "Then so it shall be," the king declared. The waiting woman was led away, her fate sealed. The prince, upon learning the truth, was overjoyed to meet his real bride. Her beauty and grace shone even brighter in her royal attire, and the two were married in a celebration that united both kingdoms. The princess, once a goose girl, ruled as queen with wisdom and compassion, and though she never forgot her hardships, she carried herself with the quiet strength of someone who had faced the world's cruelty and endured. As for the false bride, she was put naked into a barrel, studded inside with sharp nails, and dragged along in it by 2 white horses from street to street until she was dead. Our next story for tonight is The 3 Snake Leaves. In The 3 Snake Leaves, a poor young man rises to the king's attention due to his accomplishments as a soldier, and he is granted the princess's hand as a reward. Here is The 3 Snake Leaves. Once upon a time, in a small, struggling village, a father and his son sat by the hearth, the flickering firelight revealing the lines of worry etched into the old man's face. Times were hard, and the father could no longer provide for his only child. The son, sensing his father's anguish, placed a hand on his shoulder and spoke with resolve. "Father, I cannot bear to see you struggle because of me. I will leave and seek my fortune. Perhaps, somewhere out there, I can find a way to lighten our burdens." Though his heart ached at the thought, the father nodded. With a heavy sigh, he gave his son his blessing and watched him set off into the unknown, his silhouette disappearing into the horizon. The young man's journey brought him to a kingdom in turmoil, its borders threatened by a powerful enemy. The king of this land, desperate to protect his people, had called upon all able-bodied men to join his army. The young man, eager to prove himself and serve a cause greater than his own, enlisted without hesitation. In the heat of battle, chaos reigned. Arrows rained down like deadly hail, and soldiers fell one after another. The young man's comrades wavered, their spirits broken by the relentless onslaught. But as retreat loomed, the young man stepped forward, his voice cutting through the clamor. "Stand your ground," he shouted. "If we falter now, we lose everything." His courage was infectious. The soldiers rallied behind him, and with newfound determination, they pushed back the enemy. The tide of battle turned, and the kingdom was saved. When the king heard of the young man's heroics, he summoned him to the palace. "You have saved my realm," the king declared. "For your bravery, I grant you wealth, honor, and a place at my side. In the splendor of the royal court, the young man's gaze fell upon the king's daughter, a woman of rare beauty but an enigmatic air. She was known throughout the land for her strange vow. She would marry no man who was unwilling to be buried alive with her should she die first. The young man was captivated by her, his heart ensnared despite the ominous condition of her hand. When he expressed his desire to marry her, the king warned him of the price. "Do you understand what you are agreeing to?" the king asked gravely. "Should she die before you, you must join her in the grave." "I understand," the young man replied, his voice steady. "My love is worth any price." The wedding was celebrated with great splendor, joy, and music. For a time, the young man and the princess were blissfully happy. But happiness is a fragile thing, and fate is often cruel. One day, the princess fell gravely ill. Despite the efforts of the kingdom's best physicians, she succumbed to her illness, leaving her husband devastated. True to his word, the young man was led to the royal vault where her body lay. The cold stone walls seemed to press in on him as the heavy door slammed shut, sealing him inside. A table held 4 loaves of bread, 4 bottles of wine, and 4 candles, the only things standing between him and death. He sat in the oppressive silence, his heart heavy with grief and fear. The days passed slowly, each one marked by the dwindling of his provisions. One day, as the young man stared blankly at the stone walls, a rustling sound broke the silence. From the shadows emerged a snake, its sleek body gliding towards the princess's still form. "No!" the young man shouted, drawing his sword. With a swift strike, he cleaved the snake into 3 pieces. Moments later, another snake appeared, its movements hesitant as it surveyed the scene. It disappeared briefly, only to return with 3 green leaves in its mouth. Carefully, it placed the leaves on the severed parts of the first snake. To the young man's astonishment, the pieces joined together, and the snake sprang back to life. When the 2 snakes slithered away, they left the leaves behind. The young man's heart raced as an idea took hold. If the leaves could bring back a snake, could they do the same for his wife? With trembling hands, he placed 1 leaf on her mouth and the others on her eyes. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, color returned to her cheeks, and her chest rose with a shuddering breath. Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked at him in confusion. "Where am I?" she whispered. "You're with me," he said, tears streaming down his face. He gave her bread and wine to restore her strength, and together they pounded on the vault door until the sentries heard them. Though the princess had returned to life, something within her had changed. The warmth she once felt for her husband had vanished, replaced by a cold indifference. Some months later, the young man proposed a voyage to visit his aging father. The princess agreed, and they set sail across the ocean. But as they journeyed, her heart grew darker, her thoughts consumed by betrayal. One night, as the young man slept, she conspired with the ship's captain to murder him. Together, they lifted his sleeping body and cast him into the waves. Unbeknownst to them, the young man's faithful servant had witnessed everything. With quick thinking, he lowered a small boat into the water and rowed after his master. He retrieved the lifeless body from the sea and, using the 3 snake's leaves, brought him back to life. The 2 men rowed tirelessly, reaching the kingdom before the ship. They told the old king of the treachery and hid in a secret chamber to await their arrival. When the ship docked, the princess approached her father, feigning grief. She spun a tale of her husband's sudden death, praising the captain for his help. The king, however, was not deceived. "I will make the dead live again," he declared, opening the chamber door. The sight of her husband, alive and well, struck the princess like a thunderbolt. She fell to her knees, begging for mercy, but the king's face was hard. "You betrayed the man who loved you, who gave his life for you," he said. "You will reap what you have sown." The princess and her accomplice were placed aboard a ship riddled with holes and set adrift. The sea, indifferent to their cries, claimed them both. The young man, having endured so much, returned to his father's home. He carried with him the 3 snake leaves, a testament to life's fragility and the strange miracles that sometimes come to those who persevere. And so he lived on, wiser and stronger, with the knowledge that love, once betrayal, could never truly be restored. Our next story for tonight is called The Ungrateful Son. Some of the Grimm's fairy tales are quite long and feature episode after episode of horrific things happening, like murder and cannibalism and what have you. But sometimes, in a story like The Ungrateful Son, you can fit a whole lot of weird in a single paragraph. Indeed, this is a whole story documented and archived by Brothers Grimm that is only a single paragraph, likely one of the shortest fairy tales of all time. For this piece, we will read the text exactly how it was published, with no narrative modifications like we normally do. A man and his wife were once sitting by the door of their house, and they had a roasted chicken set before them, and were about to eat it together. Then the man saw that his aged father was coming, and hastily took the chicken and hid it, for he would not permit his father to have any of it. The old man came, took a drink, and went away. Now the son wanted to put the roasted chicken on the table again, but when he took it up, it had become a great toad, which jumped into his face and sat there and never went away again. And if anyone wanted to take it off, it looked venomously at him as if it would jump in his face, so that no one would venture to touch it. And the ungrateful son was forced to feed the toad every day, or else it fed itself on his face, and thus he went about the world without knowing rest. This story truly just doesn't make any sense. Next up, The Robber Bridegroom is one of the many stories of girls promised to mysterious and dangerous suitors. In this tale, a young girl's only prospect is a rich young man, but she doesn't trust the guy. In the end, the rich suitor tries to gaslight her into thinking it was all a dream. Here is The Robber Bridegroom. Once upon a time, in a quiet mill tucked away in a lush green valley, a miller lived with his only daughter. She was a beautiful young woman, known for her kindness and grace, but her father worried constantly about her future. He wanted her to marry well, to find a man who would provide for her and keep her safe. One day, a suitor arrived at the mill. He was a well-dressed man, his manner polished and confident. To the miller, he seemed an ideal match, prosperous, charming, and eager to wed his daughter. The miller, seeing no reason to doubt the man, quickly promised his daughter's hand. But the miller's daughter felt no joy in the arrangement. Whenever she looked at her betrothed, a shiver crept up her spine. There was something in his eyes, a shadow that made her uneasy. Try as she might, she could not silence the instinct that warned her something was terribly wrong. Not long after the engagement was announced, the bridegroom came to the mill and spoke to his fiancée. "You are to be my bride," he said, his voice smooth but with an undertone that made her uneasy. "Yet you have never visited my home. Come this Sunday. I will prepare a feast and show you where we will live." The girl hesitated. "I do not know the way to your house," she replied. "It is deep in the forest," he said, "but I will scatter ashes along the path so you can find it easily." Reluctantly, she agreed. But as the day of the visit approached, her unease grew. On Sunday morning, as she prepared to leave, she thought of a way to protect herself. She filled her pockets with peas and lentils, intending to scatter them along the way as a breadcrumb trail. The path through the forest was dark and winding, the sunlight barely piercing the thick canopy of leaves overhead. Though the ashes guided her steps, she dropped peas and lentils at every turn, leaving a trail behind her. At last, she came upon a house in the deepest part of the woods. It was a grim and lonely structure, its windows dark and unwelcoming. The air around it felt heavy, as if the forest itself recoiled from the place. Cautiously, she stepped inside. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the creak of the wooden floor beneath her feet. As she moved through the empty rooms, she felt as though unseen eyes were watching her. Suddenly, a voice broke the stillness. Turn back, thou pretty bride. Within this house thou must not bide, for here do evil things betide." The girl whirled around, her heart pounding. The voice came from a bird in a cage hanging on the wall. Its dark eyes glittered as it repeated its warning. Turn back, thou pretty bride. Within this house thou must not bide, for here do evil things betide." Determined to understand the danger she faced, the girl continued exploring. At last, she descended a staircase to the cellar. There, she found an old woman sitting by a large cauldron, her hands trembling as she stirred its contents. "Child, why are you here?" the old woman asked, her voice low and urgent. The girl replied that she had come to visit her bridegroom. The old woman shook her head. "You are in a house of murderers. They are cannibals, and they mean to kill you. Look at this cauldron. It is meant for you. If I do not help you, you will not leave this place alive." The girl's blood ran cold, but she steadied herself. "What must I do?" "Hide behind this cask," the old woman whispered. "Stay quiet, no matter what you hear. When night falls and the robbers sleep, I will help you escape." No sooner had the girl concealed herself than the door burst open, and a band of robbers entered, dragging a young woman with them. The poor girl begged for her life, but her cries fell on deaf ears. The robbers, drunk and laughing, forced her to drink 3 glasses of wine, 1 white, 1 red, and 1 yellow. Then, without mercy, they killed her. The miller's daughter, trembling behind the cask, watched in horror as the robbers began to dismember their victim. One of them noticed a golden ring on the dead girl's finger. When it would not come off, he took an axe and chopped off her finger. The severed digit flew through the air, landing behind the cask where the miller's daughter was hiding. It fell into her lap, the gold ring still gleaming. The robbers, growing tired, sat down to eat their gruesome feast. The old woman, quick and cunning, poured a sleeping draught into their wine. One by one, they collapsed onto the floor, their snores filling the cellar. The old woman motioned for the miller's daughter to follow her. Moving as silently as shadows, they slipped past the sleeping robbers and out into the night. The ashes scattered on the path had long since blown away, but the peas and lentils the girl had dropped had sprouted into small plants. Their green leaves glowed faintly in the moonlight, guiding the 2 women through the forest. By dawn, they reached the safety of the mill. The miller's daughter told her father everything, sparing no detail. Enraged, the miller called upon the local authorities, but he also devised a clever plan to expose the bridegroom. On the day of the wedding feast, the miller invited friends, neighbors, and the bridegroom himself. As the guests laughed and shared stories, the bride remained quiet, her expression unreadable. At last, the bridegroom turned to her. "You have not told the story, my dear. Surely you have something to share." The girl smiled faintly. "I had a strange dream," she said. "Shall I tell you?" The room grew quiet as she recounted every detail of her ordeal: the dark forest, the house of horrors, the old woman, and the robbers. When she described the severed finger falling into her lap, she reached into her pocket and produced it, holding it aloft for all to see. The bridegroom's face turned ashen. He leapt to his feet, but the guests seized him before he could flee. The authorities, summoned by the miller, soon arrived. The bridegroom and his gang were arrested and brought to trial. Their crimes were so heinous that no mercy was shown. Justice was swift, and the robbers met their end. The miller's daughter, though shaken by her ordeal, had found solace in the love and support of her father and neighbors. She vowed never to marry for anything less than true love, and live the rest of her days in peace, her courage remembered by all who knew her. The Death of the Little Hen is a tale similar to these others. While the story may seem innocent, the body count really piles up in this one. Here is The Death of the Little Hen. In the quiet, dappled light of the nut hill, where the rustling leaves was interrupted only by the occasional chirp of birds, a little hen and a little cock foraged together. The nut hill, with its rich harvest of fallen kernels, was a place they often visited. On this day, they had made a pact. Whichever of them found a nut first would share it with the other. It was a simple agreement, born out of companionship and mutual trust. As they pecked among the leaves, the little hen stumbled upon a nut larger than any she had ever seen before. Its kernel glistened, promising richness and satisfaction. But as she stared at it, a thought crept into her mind. This nut was too marvelous to share. She would eat it herself. She gave a furtive glance at the cock, who was still busy searching, and began to swallow the kernel whole. The nut, however, was too large. It lodged in her throat, cutting off her breath and filling her with panic. Her wings flapped in desperation as she clucked for help, her cries hoarse and strained. The little cock, hearing her distress, rushed to her side. "Run!" the hen managed to gasp, her voice barely audible. "Bring water, or I shall choke." The little cock, alarmed and desperate to save his companion, sped down the hill to the spring. As he arrived, he called to the stream, pleading for water. "The little hen is choking on the nut hill," he cried. "She needs water, or she will die." But the stream, in its calm and unyielding flow, demanded something in return. "Bring me red silk from the bride," it said. Only then would it yield its water. The cock wasted no time. He ran to the bride's house, his little legs moving as fast as they could carry him. Bursting into her home, he implored the bride for red silk, explaining the urgency of the hen's plight. The bride, however, had her own request. "Bring me my little wreath hanging on the window," she said, "and you shall have the silk." Out again dashed the cock, racing to the willow tree. The wreath hung high, swaying gently in the breeze, a reminder of simpler, untroubled days. He leapt and tugged at the wreath, finally pulling it free. Returning to the bride, he placed the wreath in her hands. True to her word, she gave him the red silk. Clutching it tightly in his beak, the cock ran back to the spring. The stream, seeing the crimson offering, relented and allowed its water to flow into a small, leaf-shaped bowl the cock had fashioned from a nearby plant. The cock dashed up the hill, the water precariously balanced, his heart pounding with urgency. But as he reached the spot where he had left the hen, he froze. The little hen lay motionless, her feathers ruffled and dull. The light in her eyes had faded. The kernel that had once promised satisfaction now rested as a monument to her greed. The cock dropped the bowl, water spilling onto the ground, and let out a wail of sorrow so piercing that the forest seemed to hold its breath. Animals from all around gathered at the sound. Mice scurried from their burrows, foxes and wolves emerged from the shadows, and even the mighty bear lumbered into the clearing. Together, they mourned the loss of the little hen. 6 mice, moved by the cock's grief, offered to build a carriage to carry her to her final resting place. With nimble paws, they worked through the night, crafting a tiny cart from twigs and leaves. Once it was ready, the mice hitched themselves to it, and the cock climbed aboard, holding the lifeless hen close. As the solemn procession made its way through the forest, they were joined by others. A fox trotted up and asked to ride along. "Sit at the back," the cock said, his voice hollow with sorrow. Soon after, a wolf joined, then a bear, a stag, and even a proud lion, each taking their place behind the carriage. The cart, laden with both grief and the weight of so many riders, creaked and groaned as it rolled toward the stream. When they reached the water, a new challenge awaited. How would they cross? A straw, lying by the bank, offered its help. "I will stretch across the stream," and you shall pass over me," it said. The cock hesitated, but saw no other way. The mice, pulling the carriage, ventured into the straw bridge, but the weight was too much. The straw snapped, and the mice plunged into the water, their tiny squeals swallowed by the current. The survivors regrouped, their grief compounded by the loss of the mice. A coal, smoldering nearby, volunteered next. "I am strong and will not break," it said, but as it stretched across the stream, the water hissed against its surface. The coal, too, failed, extinguished by the stream's cool embrace. Finally, a stone took pity on the mourners. "I will bear your weight," it said, settling firmly across the water. This time, the cock managed to pull the carriage across, the hen's body still cradled in the cart. But when he turned to bring the others across, disaster struck. The weight of the fox, wolf, bear, stag, and lion was too great. The carriage tipped back into the stream, dragging the animals with it. One by one, they were swept away, their cries lost to the rushing water. The little cock, now alone, dragged the carriage to a quiet clearing on the far side of the stream. With trembling claws, he dug a grave for the hen. He laid her gently into the earth, covering her with soil and crafting a small mound to mark the spot. Exhausted and heartbroken, he perched atop the mound, his once bright feathers dulled by grief. As the sun set and the forest grew quiet, the cock's sorrow consumed him. He stayed by the hen's grave, his cries growing weaker until, at last, they stopped altogether. There, in the stillness of Nut Hill, the little cock joined the hen in eternal rest. And so, one by one, every creature who had mourned that day met their end, leaving the forest silent once more. Our last story of tonight is called How Children Played Slaughter with Each Other. This last one is a real treat. It wasn't included in the latest edition of the Brothers Grimm collection, likely due to its graphic content. This story is actually two stories, each horrible in their own way. They're both based on the premise of young children deciding to play butcher, with one kid being the butcher and another being the pig. But the kids don't fully understand what pretending means, and the pig child doesn't live to play another day. In the first iteration, the child butcher is put on a strange sort of trial. The judge presents the boy with an apple and a coin and asks him to pick between them. The boy laughs and chooses the apple. The judge rules that this means the boy isn't old enough yet to reason, and so the child goes free without punishment. The second iteration is somehow even worse. In this one, a boy kills his little brother while playing, and his mother hears while she is upstairs bathing her baby. When she runs down to see what happened, she, in her madness and grief, stabs the older brother to death. While this is happening, the baby, who is left in the tub, drowns. The woman, who has now lost all of her children, hangs herself. Then the dad comes home, and who can ever imagine what he was thinking when he saw that scene? Anyway, he dies too, of course. We'll read this one straight from the book as well, since both stories are pretty short. Here is How Children Played Slaughter with Each Other. In a city named Franeker, located in West Friesland, some young boys and girls between the ages of 5 and 6 happened to be playing with one another. They chose one boy to play a butcher, another boy to play a cook, and a third boy to be a pig. Then they chose one girl to be a cook and another girl to be her assistant. The assistant was to catch the blood of the pig in a little bowl so they could make sausages. As agreed, the butcher now fell upon the little boy playing the pig, threw him to the ground, and slit his throat open with a knife, while the assistant cook caught the blood in her little bowl. A councilman was walking nearby and saw this wretched act. He immediately took the butcher with him and led him into the house of the mayor, who instantly summoned the entire council. They deliberated about this incident and did not know what they should do to the boy, for they realized it had all been part of a children's game. One of the councilmen, a wise old man, advised the chief judge to take a beautiful red apple in one hand and a golden coin in the other. Then he was to call the boy and stretch out his hands to him. If the boy took the apple, he was to be set free. If he took the coin, he was to be killed. The judge took the wise man's advice, and the boy grabbed the apple with a laugh. Thus, he was set free without any punishment. Here is the second story in this edition. There was once a father who slaughtered a pig, and his children saw that. In the afternoon, when they began playing, one child said to the other, "You be the little pig, and I'll be the butcher." He then took a shiny knife and slit his little brother's throat. Their mother was upstairs in a room bathing another child, and when she heard the cries of her son, she immediately ran downstairs. Upon seeing what had happened, she took the knife out of her son's throat and was so enraged that she stabbed the heart of the other boy who had been playing the butcher. Then she quickly ran back to the room to tend to her child in the bathtub, but while she was gone, he had drowned in the tub. Now the woman became so frightened and desperate that she did not allow the neighbors to comfort her, and finally hung herself. When her husband came back from the fields and saw everything, he became so despondent that he died soon after.